Shedling. A ray of sunrise beamed through the window shades. It crept across the floor, crawling over short white carpet, an unnecessarily fluffy turquoise rug, and finally sliding up and over the massive pile of blankets and pillows in the center of the bedroom. It was a sizable room. A raised desk occupied one corner, small wood projects and scraps of scribbled paper littering its surface. 2 standing lamps were tucked beside a wardrobe on the opposite wall, and barring a postcard-laden corkboard, the remainder of the room was evidently devoted to books. Shelves lined the walls, a personal library weighing them down with antique wisdom and modern allegory, along with a healthy sprinkling of fiction. Strands of light bulb-clad wire were strung up along the ceiling in a variety of dull colors, dimly reflecting what scant light they could get into fractal fragments glittering on every wall. The mound of cloth and stuffing shifted as sunlight landed in its occupant's eyes, and a creature rose from its comfy depths. The centipede yawning in the center of the room was easily 1.5 feet in diameter, and although the remainder of her body was hidden underneath layers of blankets, she measured 11 feet from tip to tail. An iridescent purple carapace covered her back and sides, made out of layer after layer of armored chitin plates, and her beige underside was ever so slightly on the chubby side from too many cups of hot chocolate. All 3 rows of her needle-like teeth folded inward as the yawn ended. Raising her body, Killerie Meredith Parker stretched her legs out. The dozen or so limbs outside of the blankets kinked from sleep. Gently rolling her stout neck around, she felt a chitin plate that had been bothering her slide back into place, wrapping her pleasant rise from sleep into a neat little package. With a relieved sigh, she sank back into the mountain of comfort, resting her head on the ridge of a squat, cushion big enough to be considered a battering ram in a pillow fight. Taking a deep breath, she pressed herself a little deeper into the mound. There wasn't any reason to be awake today. Granted, there were never any truly pressing matters, but Madeline liked exercise to keep both of them from getting fat, and motivation was more easily found in the earlier hours of the day. Killerie could practically feel the pillows leaching stamina out of her, pulling her back into their embrace where she could go back to Slell. "Breakfast is ready." Killerie's antennae snapped to attention as she half stumbled out of the blankets, struggling to free her legs from their clutches. 2/3 of the way down, a leg got snagged on a comforter. Her twin tails, each adding another foot to her length, snaked from the nest and flicked about. Killerie found herself unbalanced as her momentum shifted to her front, and she crashed to the ground in a heap of chitin and legs. "Is everything okay?" "I'm fine." "Mom!" Killerie hastily called back, getting her feet under her. Carefully pulling her end section out of the pile and inadvertently strewing blankets all over the floor, she paused to collect herself. The peace was broken as she charged for the door, thoughts of breakfast prominent in her mind. It slid aside as she came close, and she barreled around the corner into the narrow hallway that connected all of the rooms. She could smell breakfast, sizzling bacon, eggs. Madeline leaned into the hall, freezing Killerie in place with a frown. Her brown hair was wrapped in a hastily made bun, and while she was nearing her 40s, there was no sign of graying yet. "Did you brush your teeth?" "Can I wait until after?" Killerie's glossy black eyes were hungrily fixed on the food sitting on the kitchen table. Madeline followed her gaze and raised an eyebrow, radiating skepticism. "Okay, but you'd better be thorough." Killerie chirped in excitement, careful not to step on her mom's toes as she skittered to the table. She practically dove onto her bench, her tail end flopping over the side as she contorted to a comfortable position at the table. She ended up with a good 3 or 4 feet of body, looming over the breakfast Madeline had prepared, trying hard not to salivate. Madeline was more composed as she sat down, although her lips were quirked in a smile. "How'd you sleep?" "All good," Killerie readily answered, taking in the food. The bacon and eggs she'd smelled were present, but there was a half-full pitcher of orange juice she'd missed along with a plateful of sausage. Madeline started transferring food to her plate, bluntly stating 4 pieces of bacon. Killerie nodded, telekinetically removing the crispy pieces from their plate and putting them on their own, inwardly counting. There wasn't any reason to count, but she found an odd comfort in numbers and tried to include them whenever she could. "Can we play chess today?" Of course. Her mom didn't even have to think about it, building a breakfast sandwich from a biscuit, sausage, bacon and eggs. It was messy and disorganized, and it looked delicious, and Killerie started making her own as fast as she could. "Do you want to play traditional rules or house rules?" Killerie considered the question as she upended the entire sloppy breakfast sandwich into her mouth, and 3 rows of teeth shredded it in seconds. The taste hit a moment later, and she couldn't stop a shiver of happiness from rolling up her spine. House rules. You keep winning with the normal ones. That's because they don't change halfway through. Being Madeline gently reminded her daughter, and Killerie made a face. She ignored the look and poured herself a glass of orange juice, offering the pitcher to Killerie. The giant centipede shook her head, dumping another plateful of food into her mouth. She held her segmented mandibles in front of her teeth as she chewed in a facsimile of polite etiquette, but no matter how hard she tried, it was impossible to entirely cover her mouth. It wasn't as if she could just close it while eating, after all. Finishing off her breakfast, Killerie rolled off the bench and onto her feet. "I'll get the chessboard set up, okay?" Madeline chuckled, pausing as she swallowed. Hygiene first, board game second. Killerie hesitated for a second and gave up with a sigh as she headed back down the hallway. Madeline called after her as she walked. "You better be thorough, young lady." "I remember," Killerie lied back, adding it to the list and mentally cursing her stomach for being greedy. Taking a right before her bedroom, she went into the bathroom. Here was the room where the difference between their species was the most marked. The bathtub, occupying half of the room, was enormous, easily 7 feet square, and a small arsenal of brushes and bristles hung from the wall above it. The toilet didn't look unusual, but a sizable pink sponge lay soaking in a small bowl on the vanity beside a green toothbrush. Killerie went to the vanity and checked her reflection with a sigh. Shedling teeth were not easy to clean via normal methods, but as with everything else, Madeline had figured out a workaround. Killerie shoved the sponge in her mouth and felt her teeth sink into it, the foam gradually expanding between her teeth and filling every gap. It was a little uncomfortable, but it worked. Almost absently, she turned the bathtub on, and it started filling with hot water from several faucets. She used her telekinesis to move the sponge around in her mouth, abrupt motions that usually got all of the gunk that accumulated. It still took a few minutes before the reflection of her teeth in the mirror was satisfactory. Without further preamble, Killerie slid into the tub, sinking under the surface with an irrepressible grin as the heated water seeped beneath her plates, warming everything from the chitting down and easing the persistent soreness at the base of her antennae. With only her head above the water, Killerie closed her eyes. The heat, the slight pressure, the quiet sound of dripping water, it was almost as good as sleep. Still, all good things had to come to an end. In Killerie's case, that was when the water cooled, and so it was with a dramatic and utterly unnecessary sigh that she withdrew from the tub and began to dry off with a towel. Once she was done, she paused and glanced at one of the bigger brushes. Making a decision, she grabbed it and left the bathroom, the bristled tool bobbing along behind her. Her mom had long since finished her breakfast and was seated in an armchair in the living room. It was a pleasant space, more than sizable enough for a centipede of Killerie's proportions, with furniture built to match. Most of it was long couches and lamps, but plenty of natural light shone in through the massive windows on the east side of the room. Madeline smiled as she came in with the brush. Killerie didn't need to say anything. She simply crawled onto the couch beside her mother and gave her the brush. She heard a faint grunt as she rested the considerable weight of her head in Madeline's lap, but then she felt her mom's hand land a little further up her back. She started brushing Killerie's plates a moment later. It was a comforting feeling. Madeline had a lot of experience brushing centipede chitine at this point, and the steady back and forth pressure, and the dull sensation lulled Killerie into a dozing half-torpor. "Did you really sleep okay?" Madeline murmured. Killerie considered the question along with the faint concern in her mom's tone. She hadn't woken up during the night and she hadn't gone to sleep late, but no, she finally mumbled. Do you know why? No. Was it a nightmare? I don't think so. Do you want to talk about it? Not really. Madeline quietly laughed. You don't have to. Killerie fell silent as her eyes slightly sank into her head, hard eyelids covering them as she closed her eyes. Her mom began brushing a little harder, working the bristles between the chinks as she gently rubbed her daughter's plaits. Love you, Mom, Killerie whispered, pushing more of her head and neck into Madeline's lap. Love you too, Cocoa Bean. Chapter 2. Coffee shop. Killerie was even with the table's surface, her entire body lying close to the ground. Her eyes were half closed as she squinted at the chessboard and the pieces atop it, trying to figure out how to win. Madeline sat across her, an irritatingly neutral expression on her face with one leg folded on top of the other. The chessboard had noticeably more black than white pieces on it at the moment, a complex constellation of bishops and rooks and pawns dividing ecstatic victory from crushing defeat. This is why I like house rules, Killerie muttered. Her mom made a very unmomly snort. You know, I don't think a find a new angle is supposed to be taken literally. It worked for Chaucer from the cartoon, Killerie replied with a non-committal hum, as she tried to find a way to salvage victory, assessing her assembled troops. 2 pawns left, one near the end, a bishop trapped by an enemy knight close to her own side, and a rook sticking close to her king. I don't know how you set this up, Killerie finally complained. I got your queen really early. Queens aren't everything. So you say that, but they kind of are. She protested. They can do everything any of the other pieces can, except for the knights, Madeline replied, reminding her how she'd lost her queen in this particular game, and Killerie grumbled a wordless protest against the rules of chess. She kept staring at the board, musing on how she could win. The eventualities were obvious at the moment. Move the pawn forward, enter checks, escape checkmate. Take a bishop with her rook, enter check, try to escape checkmate. Move her king, checkmate. Move her other pawn forward 1 space and get a queen, enter check, try to escape checkmate. Killerie paused. She didn't have to get a queen, did she? With a smug grin, she telekinetically moved her pawn forward 1 space, and Madeline automatically reached for the queen piece. Give me a knight. Madeline glanced up, plastic surprise written all over her face. Really? Killerie nodded, her mind racing as her mom put the horse-shaped piece on the board. She started figuring out pathways, opening doors for ways she could use the newly obtained knight to somehow pull this back and win. Madeline moved the bishop diagonally 2 spaces, ending in a black square with direct line of sight to Killerie's king. Checkmate. Killerie pouted in the way that only an 11-foot centipede could as she started resetting the chessboard, picking up all of the pieces simultaneously and individually directing each one to their respective places. Madeline stood up and headed past Killerie for the kitchen, tunelessly humming as she did. Killerie ignored her entirely, focused on making sure all of the pieces properly faced each other and that they were in the dead center of each square. Once she was done, she straightened with a sigh and turned to find her mom filling a pair of glasses with milk from a measuring cup, steam rising from each one. Killerie squeaked in excitement, almost tripping over her legs again as she rushed into the kitchen. Madeline smiled at her as she crouched, reaching under the counter to retrieve the powder for the hot chocolate. Killerie was almost dancing, hopping from leg to leg in alternating pairs all the way down her body as her mom got the hot chocolate ready. Madeline stood with a frown. The can of hot chocolate mix, notably absent. We're out of hot chocolate. Killerie's mouth fell open. Mandibles split wide in abject dismay. We're out. Her mom nodded seriously. I forgot to get more after your last molt. Killerie pouted, thinking for a few seconds. The past molt had been, well, she wanted to think worse than normal, but it had been pretty much exactly as bad as all the other ones. Growing another pair of legs would never be comfortable. and hot chocolate was exactly the sort of thing to make her feel better afterwards. Madeline shrugged, dismissing the issue. "We can head over to coffee shop and get some." "Sound good?" Killerie bobbed her head up and down in frenetic agreement, the wiggle returning to her legs. Her mom smiled at the sight. "All right, go hop in the van and I'll get my card." "What are you?" "Evio se asti." "Pretty sure." The van in question was a blocky thing, the same Shedling-approved shade of pasty white that most of their creations were. It had a smattering of scratches and dents, along with a few places where Killerie had creatively put up a few designs of her own. When she was younger, obviously. At any rate, the colourful splotches had long since been covered by paint. Pulling the sliding door open with a thought, Killerie ungainly inserted herself into the back of the van. The back rows of seats had been removed to make space for her bulk, although a reinforced hammock made out of toe straps and rope had replaced them. All she had to do was curl her legs under her body and strap herself in. Madeline hopped in the driver's seat and started the van with a push. And it started up with a smooth purr, pulling out of the garage. She headed down the driveway and off to coffee shop. Killerie put her face as close to the window as she could manage without actually touching it, staring out at the houses of her neighbours passing by. None of them were identical, but that was more because the Shedling architects supposedly hated uniformity in design. They shared certain aspects, 1 or 2 stories, a garage, some modest landscape. Several people were out jogging, their dogs sprinting ahead of them with the excitement and energy that canines seem to have in inexhaustible supply. As they left the concentric rings of the subdivision and the organized layout of the houses, their surroundings almost immediately changed to taller buildings with self-descriptive titles. The shopping district of Odman's 314th Preserve was a smaller place than the home district, mostly because a good number of people just didn't want to work. It was more active here, a bustling traffic of customers and visitors wandering from shop to shop. The contents of each store varied enormously. Woodworking, artistry, tattoo artists, recording studios, pet shops, restaurants, repair shops, therapists. Almost every occupation had a representative building here, even if some of them didn't have any temps in them, and every store's exterior matched its purpose. Coffee shop was exactly what it sounded like. A pleasant little place with plenty of large windows and wood paneling that served hot drinks. Coffee was, as far as Killerie could tell, an absolute necessity for humanity to function. Madeline certainly seemed to think so. More to the point, there were quite a few people who liked experimenting with hot drinks, which meant coffee shop was always well staffed with temps. Madeline pulled into a free parking space and got out of the van, Killerie following suit. They waited for a moment so Killerie could get her legs under her, and then they headed inside. Coffee shop had quite a few people in it, despite it being in the early afternoon, and Killerie felt a familiar twinge of anxiety at all the faces she'd never seen. It eased somewhat as she scanned people working behind the counter, and she promptly galumphed over to the gigantic human building of Frappuccino on the leftmost side of the counter. "Hi, Sierra. How are you?" TR was one of the few people who could make Killerie feel small, mostly because he was standing on the edge of 7 feet and was broad to boot. He had a mop of bristly black hair, and his skin was so tanned it was almost odd. He had a wrinkly face, but that was more from too much smiling than age, although she didn't have the slightest idea how old he was. As she approached, he gave her a blinding grin. "Killerie, how are you and your mum?" "We're doing okay. We ran out of hot chocolate, though." He nodded understandingly, capping the coffee cup in front of him with a plastic lid. "I'll get right on that in a moment. Ayona, your drink's ready?" A shockingly pale woman sidled past Killerie, watching her out of the corner of her eye, and grabbed the cup from Sierra, backing away. She pivoted, walked to the back of the shop, and left through the exit furthest from the giant centipede. Killerie ignored her as her mum walked up to the counter. She had somehow greeted Madeline with an even bigger grin. "Miss Parker, your kid was just telling me you two need some hot chocolate. You got any preferences on additions?" Madeline shook her head with a faint smile. "Put whatever you think I'll like in it." Killerie. Killerie agreed, and CR loudly clapped. "All right then. For Miss Parker, I'm thinking ground peppermint and a caramel shot. And for Killerie, I was going to put some cinnamon and chocolate bits in, and maybe a glop of honey. How do you feel about whipped cream?" Both mother and daughter nodded, and CR slapped the surface of the counter. He had a tendency to express himself through violent motions. As far as Killerie, he could tell, she'd never met someone who could make so many noises with their hands. He held a finger up, forestalling their departure. "Oh, that booth in the back should be open. Feel free to hang out for a bit, at least until I can chat with you guys properly." Madeline led Killerie to the table in question. It was the only corner table in the coffee shop. It had a bench folding around the corner, and was also the only seat that could comfortably fit her size. Once she deposited her bulk on the extended seat, there wasn't much to do except wait, absently looking around coffee shop. Killerie noticed one of the baristas glaring at him. He was a relatively small boy with an uneven tan contrasting mellow skin that suggested he'd been wearing a hat for a long time. He had shockingly frizzy blonde hair and almond eyes screwed up in a scowl very pointedly aimed at her. She awkwardly looked away, muttering, "Mom, that guy's staring at me." Madeline leaned forward to make out what Killerie had said. Twisting her head around, she shot the barista a far fiercer glare, and he flinched. Turning back to Killerie, she said, "Good job telling me. If you see anyone else, let me know and I'll take care of it." "Okay, Bean." He was once again scowling at Killerie. She'd seen plenty of fear and a good bit of wariness, but this was the first time she'd seen blatant hatred directed at her. It was a deeply uncomfortable feeling, not unlike molting. Pulling her attention back to the present, she gave her mother a weak smile, trying to keep her antennae from twitching. Inwardly, she begged whoever might be listening. Zillion, maybe. That CR would bring their drinks over and she could go home, wrap up in her blankets with her plushies and forget about him. It was a few minutes, but CR eventually bellowed from the back of the shop. "Hi, Mrs. Parker and Parker. I got your drinks ready." Someone came around the corner of the counter holding their drinks, and there was a stuttering moment of cruel reality acknowledging itself before Killerie realized it was the boy who had been glaring at her. He now bore an expression which was impossible to mistake for anything except rancid malice. Killerie's stomach launched up to her throat, and she squirmed away from the approaching teenager, almost falling in Madeline's lap in the process. She hiccuped, trying to get away and finding nowhere to escape to. Madeline grabbed Killerie, trying to look her in the eye. People were looking over at the wriggling centite. "Killerie, what's wrong?" Killerie heard a faint pop as the boy flicked the lids off the cups, and she saw steam rising from each one. He was too close now, and she found herself unable to say a word as he tripped forward, jerked the cups towards them, and accurately sent 32 ounces of hot chocolate at Killerie's face. She barely managed to close her eyes in time, a jagged shriek building in her throat as the boiling hot liquid impacted the soft flesh under her jaw and mandibles, and the world dissolved into a white sheen of static. The pain shot up to agony beyond and then muted, disappearing to the backdrop of the static. She couldn't open her eyes. There was still scalding liquid on her face. She couldn't see. It was dark. It was dark. Where was? Arms wrapped around her upper neck and head, and she jerked away before she recognized the firm grip of her mother. The static filling her ears faded slightly, and she heard Madeline's voice through the noise. "Killerie, can you hear me?" "I can hear you," Killerie blurted, and she realized that if she had been able to cry, she would have been sobbing. "Mom." It hurt. There was a pause before her mom spoke again, and Killerie could hear her voice hitch. "Can you walk?" Killerie blindly nodded, even though she was trying not to move, and her mom firmly put a hand on her lower stomach. Something soft was pressed against her face, and a few passes later, the majority of the hot chocolate was off her face. Madeline slowly guided Killerie out of the booth, talking in a soothing voice. "Let's get you to the van, okay?" "Oh, okay." Treading slowly and carefully, Killerie allowed herself to be led. A constant, unwinnable conflict was taking place, and the battlefield was split between her brain and her instinct. She was walking blind. Anything could happen, but she knew she shouldn't open her eyes if there was any hot chocolate left on her face. They paused a moment later, and her mom told her, "We're by the van. Do you think you can get in?" Killerie badly wished she could cry. I don't know." "Oh, Bean." Her mom sounded like she was about to cry, which only scared Killerie even more. "How bad did it look? How hot had the drinks been?" An arm wrapped around her back, hooked beneath the carapace plate. "I'm going to help you in, okay?" "Step up now." Killerie wriggled forward, legs straining to find the edge of the van step and discovering it closer than expected. Her mom heaved upward, and Killerie scrabbled into the vehicle, automatically ducking as her antennae brushed across the ceiling. Her hearing was slowly recovering, and she heard the van door slam shut. Slowly, gradually, sound began to come through the white noise in her head. "Mom?" she asked. A hand immediately pulled her head forward between the driver's seat and shotgun, and she barely felt the kiss planted on her forehead. "I'm so sorry, Bean. We're going to get you home, okay?" Killerie barely nodded, not wanting to move away from her mother. "Oh, okay." After a few seconds, Killerie felt her mom's weight shift. The sound of a canister opening filtered through her senses, and then her mom worriedly asked Bean, "Do you think you can eat these?" Killerie nosed forward until she felt Madeline's other hand bump into her forehead. Careful not to move the burned flesh of her neck and upper stomach, she opened her mouth and tilted her head backward. She felt a few small pills fall into her mouth a moment later, and she bit down on them. They were bitter, but if they could get rid of the burning pain, she was willing to stomach far worse. She felt a slight jerk as the van backed out of the parking space, and then they took off in smooth movements, heading for home and comfort. Killerie just didn't get it. She couldn't understand why. Why did that boy hate her so much? She'd never met him. It wasn't her. It couldn't be her fault. So why did she feel like it was? Why was she so miserable? She pushed into her mom's hand, and Madeline started rubbing her carapace with slow, reassuring motion. Chapter 3. Malt. Killerie quietly stared at the corkboard on her wall. Green moonlight illuminating everything in chlorophyll tints. Snugly ensconced in the wrappings of her blankets, she could acutely feel the ripples and tears in the soft flesh beneath her jaw and face, bright spots of stinging pain that made it hurt to move. The corkboard in question was covered in experiences. The first and last time Madeline had taken Killerie to karaoke, where they learned the speech device couldn't synthesize singing. When she'd taken Madeline's phone apart and put it back together, that day she'd taken a few old malts and put them together to make the scariest sculpture her mom had ever seen. It had been a bit horrifying in hindsight, Killerie thought dully. Now they just threw the malts away. She wasn't worried about scarring. She knew how Shedlings worked. Anything that didn't kill them would be fixed the moment they molted. If anything, she'd probably end up more resistant to scalding liquids once she molted. No, she was more worried about the malt itself. She sank a little deeper into her nest with a sigh. Her mom had liberally daubed antibiotic cream on the fried flesh, and it was starting to itch. However, if she tried to rub it off with her blankets, then her mom would get worried and she'd have to let a new layer be applied. In much the same way they had been for the past 2 hours, Killerie's thoughts turned to the boy who'd thrown the drinks at her. She couldn't stop replaying it for some reason. How could it have gone differently? Telekinetically catching the drinks, jumping out of the way, asking for help before he could get closer. It was with a sudden spike of realization and fear that she realized her carapace was itching. Tossing the blankets off, she stared down at her in segments. Her tails had already fused along her underside, and a porous grey film was rising out of her plates, seeping together and hardening. An unconscious reflex pulled her rearmost pair of legs inward, and they were sealed under the forming cocoon. Killerie shrieked, dragging herself out of her nest. Her paralyzed section spread more, expanding further up Killerie's back and trapping another pair of legs. Madeline was in the room in an instant, cradling Killerie's head in her hands with an urgent worry in her eyes. "I'm here." Another segment was trapped, and Killerie's breathing picked up a notch. Mom, I don't want. Her mother sat down cross-legged and pulled Killerie's head into her lap as another section was covered in the cocoon. "I'm so sorry, Bean. You're going to be okay, I promise." 3 sections were frozen, the chrysalis accelerating as it grew. Almost half of Killerie's body was immobile, but everything she could move jerked uncontrollably as her muscles tensed. Senseless terror loading her nervous system with aimless adrenaline. Killerie almost couldn't think straight. All she could see was herself, paralyzed in an empty room forever. And she pushed closer. Mom. Madeline closed her eyes, hugging Killerie close to her heart as another 2 segments were trapped. "I'm here, Cocoa Bean. I'm right here." In a burst of speed, the chrysalis expanded upward, trapping Killerie's final pair of legs and ending her movements entirely. Killerie could only stare up at her mom's face as her breathing slowed and her antenna bent backward, unable to resist the simple act of molting. Her jaw was forced shut along with her eyes, and Killerie gratefully passed out. She was trapped again. Killerie's mandibles flexed in a single powerful motion, tearing the already decaying cocoon on her face. She sucked a desperate breath in, incomparable relief flooding her system at the taste of fresh air. Her mom was there the moment the chrysalis was breached, pulling grey material away from Killerie's head. She opened her eyes as fast as she could, blinking in the sudden light. Orange light streamed through her window, gilding everything in gold. Killerie groaned. As she dragged herself forward, Madeline stepping out of the way as she slid out of the mulch she'd left behind. Her legs were freed 2 by 2 until she finally slumped on the plush carpet, with the burns mended and a faint crimson hue mixed into the blue-green of her natural chitin. She balefully glared at the hollow husk of a Shedling behind her. Everything from the nicks in her plates to the silhouette of the telepathy caps was perfectly replicated in chrysalis imitation, although it deflated without her inside it. Madeline pulled Killerie into an awkward hug, planting a kiss on the top of her head. She didn't say anything. She was just there, ready for when Killerie needed her, just the same as she'd been there for Killerie's whole life. Killerie pulled her body inward, curling into a ball and resting a good chunk of herself in her mom's lap. Madeline grunted at the weight, but didn't ask her to move. The light beaming through the window dulled to a smoky brown, fading into grey and then green. The sun set on a day Killerie had entirely missed. Finally, Killerie mumbled, "You can go if you want to. Only if you want me to, Bean." Killerie didn't reply, stuck between wanting to be alone and feeling guilty about asking her mom to leave. Without saying a word, Madeline gave her a final tight hug and pulled Killerie's thickest blanket over, covering her plates and resting it behind Killerie's antennae. Scooting backwards, she rubbed the softer chitin above her eyes and whispered, "Get some sleep. Okay?" Killerie nodded, and her mom left the room, turning the lights on a low setting before closing the door. Killerie didn't go to sleep. The discarded malt stared at, bringing complicated, unnamed feelings to the surface of Killerie's thoughts. Why was she so bad at being a Shedling? Molting was supposed to be an effortless, painless part of life for Shedlings. From what little information they put out about themselves, it was downright pleasant. For them, molting was an improvement, an upgrade to counter previous injuries. She knew that was the case for herself, and she knew that hot chocolate wouldn't burn her anymore. But the moment she lost feeling in her limbs, the involuntary loss of control as her legs curled up. Her eyes closed and her antennae lay flat. That feeling of being forced to go to sleep without any chance of stopping it. It terrified her, and she didn't know why. According to Madeline, that would be a normal reaction for a human, but Killerie wasn't a human. She was just Killerie. She didn't really know who that was, if she was being honest. It wasn't until an hour or two later, far past when Killerie knew she was supposed to be asleep, that Madeline leaned into her room. "Are you awake?" she whispered. Killerie didn't even turn around, pointedly ignoring the moult in the room. "What is it?" "The nuisance elves came back," Madeline replied. Killerie's head snapped up as she craned around, staring at her mom. "Again?" Madeline nodded seriously. "The microwave isn't working anymore." "Do you want to?" "Yeah," Killerie replied, climbing out of her nest. "Might as well." Nuisance elves were tiny creatures that took technology apart and hid the pieces all over the house. Killerie had never seen them, but they dismantled everything from frothers and electric toothbrushes to coffee makers, and on one memorable occasion, the back of the refrigerator. Killerie passed her mom, who at least looked relieved she was up and about. Raising her head, she took a good sniff. She had a feeling about components. She'd wanted to call it the sixth sense, but apparently that was already taken, so she called it second scent. There was something in the bathroom. Killerie went in and started hunting. It was only a few minutes before she found the microwave's waveguide, hidden behind a few almost empty shampoo bottles. Curiosity gradually climbing, Killerie left the bathroom and kept looking. The magnetron was in the kitchen, under a jar of cookies, and the power supply was hidden underneath one of the couch cushions. Curling up in the middle of the living room, and surrounded by hovering components, Killerie pulled the microwave over to her and set it down. Madeline brought her a mug of hot chocolate and her favorite blanket. Killerie barely noticed, although she did briefly wonder if Madeline had gone and bought more drink mix while Killerie was unconscious. Setting the broken microwave on the floor, Killerie gently teased the screws out of their sockets with a careful telekinetic effort, one by one. Lifting a few objects was one thing. Rotating something was an entirely different matter. Removing the back, she flipped it on its front and started putting the components back in. It was relatively simple. Power supply here, plug it back in, magnetron in the back corner, attach it to the supply. Waveguide right next to it, and thankfully the stirrer was still intact. The nuisance elves never took anything apart. So thoroughly that she couldn't fix it, Killerie thought with satisfaction. Madeline wrapped her in the blanket and leaned on her plates, a warm and comforting presence against her back. Killerie was focused on the microwave, although she did take a sip of the hot chocolate she'd been given. Replacing the back panel, she plugged it into the wall and since it didn't work, Killerie frowned. Was it possible that the elves took something apart internally and didn't remove it? They'd never done that before. With a resigned sigh, she took the panel off again, pulling the parts out. If nothing else, this was a welcome distraction from her mold. It took 80 minutes and a second cup of hot chocolate. In the middle of the living room, illuminated by green moonlight, lay a giant centipede, fast asleep. A microwave sat on the floor next to her, a barely audible purr emanating from its angled metal shape, and her mom slept against her side. Killerie woke up on the floor. Her mom gave her a smile. Instead of waiting by the kitchen table, she brought the breakfast over to Killerie and set it down in the living room. Killerie wasn't sure why she found that so exciting. It was still the same breakfast, just in a place where she normally wasn't allowed to have food. Stretching her legs, Killerie settled back under her blanket, resting her head on the plates further down her back. "Good morning." "Good morning to you too," Madeline replied. "Are you feeling better?" Killerie thought about it for a moment. She'd molted, which had been horrible as usual, but she'd fixed the microwave and been helpful to her mom as a result. And she was having breakfast in the living room. Yep. She decided, and Madeline chuckled. They stopped talking. and the silence was broken only by the sounds of crunchy cereal being chewed in a mouth that couldn't fully close. "I have a surprise for you." Killerie looked up in the middle of a bite. One advantage of a speech device was that she could talk with her mouth full, which she promptly did. "What is—" "I got reserved tickets for us to go on a vacation." Killerie paused. "A vacation? It's not like last time when we went to the beach," Madeline added, and Killerie shivered at the memory. Crabs and centipedes did not get along, as it turned out. "I was thinking we could go to some place a little further away." Killerie frowned, trying to figure out what she meant. "A New York?" Her mum shook her head, a faint grin slowly appearing. "I was thinking Granates." Killerie almost fell over, nearly upending her bowl. "Another planet? We're going to space." Madeline took a sip of chocolate milk with an undisguised smile. "We're already in space, Bean." "You know what I mean." Killerie shot back, but her mind was elsewhere entirely. She'd only been to actual space once, when she'd been adopted, and that didn't count because she didn't remember it at all. Space was huge. She thought it was just big when she was younger, but her mom had taught her about kilometers, continents, and then planets, solar systems, light years, galaxies, and the universe. It was impossible for anyone to ever see everything that existed. Which, of course, meant Killerie wanted to give it a shot. "You? Do we need luggage? I mean, I don't have any clothes and you..." "Wait, should I have clothes? I feel like I should bring a hat or something if I'm going to space." "Oh, I should bring a plushie." "But which plushie?" "Or I could bring some blankets." "And wait, should..." Madeline cut Killerie's rambling off before she could get too far. "We don't leave until tomorrow morning, Killerie. You don't have to worry about lug." "Tomorrow morning." Killerie nearly shrieked, her Vofoda breaking the end of the word off in her shock. Her mom snorted in amusement. "Well, I thought you'd be excited. They're a present from CR." He reserved both the tickets as an apology. Killerie wasn't listening. Dumping her breakfast in her mouth, she rolled off her couch and skittered for her room. Her nest was still a mess, and the flaking malt gave her a frosty glare, but she wasn't paying attention to either. Crawling up the wall and partly across the ceiling, Killerie pulled the attic hatch open and shoved her head inside. Several multicolored bins sat inside, mostly full of lawn decorations, old toys, and a few boxes Madeline kept locked. More importantly, an entirely unused red suitcase sat in the back of the attic. There was a very small spider web, an even smaller spider occupying the pocket on the front. Careful not to dislodge the spider, Killerie levitated the suitcase over to herself and backed down into her room. Placing it on her floor, she paused for a moment. What was she supposed to do with the spider? It'd been living on the suitcase longer than she'd been using it, and it felt rude to kick it out of its home. Granted, there probably weren't very many flies or gnats in the attic. Making a quick decision, Killerie picked the spider up and carefully grabbed its web too. She strung the web up in the corner of the room and put the spider in the middle. It immediately shot for the darkest part of the ceiling and hid their tiny little eyes, glinting in Killerie's direction. With her empathy satisfied, Killerie dove back for the suitcase and threw it open. She'd had easily a dozen plushies buried somewhere in her nest, and she wasn't looking forward to deciding which ones she wanted to bring. Naturally, she was bringing her second favorite blanket because she couldn't lose her favorite blanket, and she had to bring her beanbag pillow for the trip there. To make it even better, she had room left over for more than one plushie. Boris the dog, Mavis the lizard, and Benny the sky had followed shortly, since they were going to be souvenirs. She went ahead and put a satchel in the front pocket. Next, she put in her third favorite hat, a giant flat one with a floppy brim that made her feel like a pirate. 3 scarves followed it in short order. A very nice plaid one that Madeline had bought a long time ago that was starting to wear thin. A rather fluffy purple one that Killerie had knitted herself, and an emerald green one that matched her chitin, according to Madeline. After a moment's thought, she decided to pack the extra Volker, just to be safe. Zipping the suitcase up, She happily set it next to the door and tried to remember if she'd forgotten anything. She figured out that if she had forgotten something, she wouldn't remember it anyway. So there was no point in trying. Charging into the hallway, she barreled towards the kitchen, opened the cereal box, and retrieved a single piece. Madeline was folding Killerie's favorite blanket on the living room floor while she gave Killerie a raised eyebrow. She didn't say anything. Heading back to her room, Killerie carefully set the cereal piece in the middle of the rescued spider's web. She didn't know whether they ate cereal or not, but it would hopefully appreciate the apology either way. Without anything more to do, Killerie walked into the living room. Before her mom could get them, she yanked the empty mugs off the table and into the sink in the kitchen. "You need to pack too," Madeline chuckled. "I don't have much to pack, Bean, and it's not until tomorrow morning." "I already packed everything," Killerie irritably huffed. "Did you remember your Scheitin polish?" Killerie froze and then went for the bathroom. Madeline's laughter followed her down the hallway as she ran. "What do you do when you meet strangers?" "Not talk to them. And if they try to sell you something, don't talk to them." "What do you do if you can't find me?" Killerie paused at the question, thinking for a moment, and then checked a small stack of cards in front of her. It took a few seconds to rifle through them before she looked back up at her mom with an eager expression. "I yell really loudly until you can come and find me." Madeline chuckled. "Not quite. Find another Shedling if you can and ask for a phone." Killerie's antenna drooped. "Oh." Leaning forward from her cross-legged position, Madeline gently patted Killerie on the head. "It's okay. Just don't get too far, and you won't have to worry about it." Killerie gave her a wan smile. "But what if I forget?" Her mom planted a kiss on her forehead. "I'll remember for both of us." With a sigh, Killerie got onto her feet and started cleaning up the discarded bits of paper they'd used to make the flashcards. Scooping them all up into a pile, she opened the trash can with a thought and dumped them in. Killerie was starting to realize that space, as epic as it was, had a lot of issues. Madeline's card wouldn't refill so long as they weren't on Oddman. And as it turned out, a lot of things cost money everywhere else. One of the few pros was that Madeline had reserved a two-way flight before her card was refilled, which meant they were free to spend the remainder of the money on alien souvenirs, alien food, alien plushies, and hopefully at least one alien blanket. Killerie had no idea how exactly a blanket could be alien, but she was certain it would be very interesting. Madeline took a sip of water. "It'll be fine." "But what if isn't?" Killerie fretted, folding one of the blankets on the floor and placing it in the overflowing blanket nook. "It will be," her mom reassured her. "There are only so many ways a vacation can go wrong, and most of them are covered by whatever the Shedlings build. There's no need to worry." Killerie deflated, flopping onto the carpet. Madeline Allwood pulling the Shedling's head into her lap and rubbing Killerie's plate. "Are you really that worried?" Killerie was quiet for a long moment. "I just really want it to go well." Madeline sighed. "Well," turning around, she leaned on Killerie's back, folding her hands in her lap. Her presence felt tense somehow. "Okay, what's the absolute worst thing that can happen?" Killerie stared into her mom's eyes and solemnly told her. "The planet blows up. And how would it do that?" Killerie paused. "I'm figuring it out." Her mom gently laughed, pulling Killerie in closer and giving her a hug. Killerie wrapped her legs around her mom's stomach, still unable to fully silence the worries close to her heart. After a restless night of excited waiting, Killerie had woken up early, eaten a hasty breakfast, collected her luggage, and climbed in the van. Madeline apparently lived on a sleeping schedule that didn't quantify 4 in the morning as merely early, which meant Killerie had unwillingly taken a bath while her mom got ready to go. A long drive had followed, carrying Killerie far outside their normal range. Now they were at a terminal with 3 suitcases and a satchel with what Madeline called a safety measure inside, and Killerie was wriggling. She couldn't help herself. She'd never been good at containing her excitement, and it spilled out of her soul through her bouncy alternating steps, her head bobbing from the movement. The terminal was a massive, blocky structure bigger than any structure Killerie had ever seen. Oddly, she couldn't see any planes or spaceships blasting off into space to meet with the interplanetary ships, but she couldn't figure out how else anyone was supposed to get up or down. The biggest source of her glee at the moment came from the terminal lady. Or at least Killerie thought it was a lady, because it was also an alien. She was taller than Killerie, with mottled purple skin. 6 bright blue eyes sat above a long snout loaded with teeth, and 2 triple-jointed arms gracefully tapped away on her keyboard. Killerie couldn't see anything from the chest down, dressed in a very nice beige turtleneck, but whenever she moved it was unnervingly smooth, all of which was secondary to the fact she was an alien. Madeline walked back from talking to the alien, looking through the paperwork she'd been given. "Okay, Bean, are you ready to..." She trailed off, taking in Killerie's bobbling. An inevitable smile leaked onto her face. "You look ready to go." Killerie nodded, telekinetically seizing the handles of the suitcases that had wheels. Who was that did she hiss when she said words with "in" them? What did she smell like? Madeline chuckled as she grabbed the last of her luggage. That was the desk agent. She didn't hiss, and it's not polite to ask about smell. Killerie pouted irritably, following her mom and dragging the suitcases along. The terminal's hallways were brightly lit, with plenty of benches and places to sit. A few screens displayed starship arrivals and departures. There were a lot more people than Killerie had expected here, although most of them didn't seem to care too much about her presence, which felt a bit odd. Aside from the desk agent and Killerie herself, everyone else was human. Killerie would have been lying if she'd said she wasn't disappointed, but they weren't on the ship yet. Killerie craned her head over Madeline's shoulder, trying to get a good picture of the floor map she was looking at. The layout wasn't particularly complicated. The lobby was one of the larger parts, but there seemed to be a good number of much bigger rooms further back in the building that didn't have an obvious purpose, along with several unmarked hallways. It was hard to tell what exactly they were for. Unfortunately, the gift shop wasn't marked, so the map was essentially useless as far as she was concerned. She backed off with an inaudible sigh. Excitement fading, she glanced up and found a Shedling approaching them. The centipede was bigger than Killerie, easily 16 or 15 feet long, but also thinner. A rippling green-blue pattern repeated down its back, flowing along the dense overlapping chitin plates. It had 4 mandibles instead of Killerie's 2, and a white circular device sat on the side of its neck, one identical to the one her own neck. It made a beeline for Killerie and Madeline, moving much faster than Killerie could. Coming to a stop before them, it pulled its legs beneath it and reared up, mandibles clacking rhythmically. A flat male voice came out of it. Killerie of the exceptional mind. Killerie nervously glanced at her mom, and Madeline stepped in front of her. Killerie Meredith Parker, actually. "And I'm her mother, Madeline. Do you need something?" The Shedling silently stared at both of them, and Killerie wondered how many millions of others were watching them through his eyes. "You have never expressed a desire to leave the planet." His words were almost accusatory, and Killerie nearly stepped forward in her mother's defense before Madeline spoke. "My daughter and I are on our way to Granitize. We already reserved the tickets." Her voice was polite, but Killerie felt like there was another conversation going on, one she didn't know the words to. The Shedling seemed a little stuck, as if he were thinking his words through. A deafening silence filled the hallway, drawing Killerie's attention to the fact that the other humans had left in very short order. "Please follow me," he finally stated, and turned around. Killerie glanced at her mom. Madeline's face was drawn in tense lines, stiff worry easing through the cracks. She noticed Killerie's gaze and smoothly relaxed, the anxiety vanishing as though it had never been there. We should follow him. The sudden change unnerved Killerie. How many other worries had she missed? Killerie did as her mother asked, her gaze flicking between Madeline and the Shedling as they walked. A gentle patter of echoes followed the footsteps of both Shedlings, with Madeline's shoes clacking on the ceramic floor. As they walked, Killerie gradually began to notice a dull static in her ears. It was barely audible, a nearly silent thrum of activity that ebbed with the beat of her heart. It was attractive somehow. It brought feelings to the back of her mind that she didn't have names for, things she'd never felt before. The Shedling stopped in front of a large sliding door, neatly ensconced in the wall, and Killerie vaguely realized he was watching her. The door slid open without introduction. The static built to a buzz as the small group took in the sight of several hundred Shedlings in a massive open room. Big ones, larger than Killerie and oddly familiar, huddled around a chunk of glowing technology that she couldn't identify. Small ones, only 3 or 4 feet long, scuttling between the legs of their companion, and above it all, half a dozen truly gigantic Shedlings, their sheer size threading about the room. Any one of them had to be hundreds of meters long, but their care in avoiding the centipedes below was unmistakable. The floor was alive with motion, a wriggling chaos of perfectly timed steps and angled bodies. Do you feel different? At the Shedling's question, Killerie realized her mandibles had fallen open and closed them, embarrassed. She'd gone her whole life without seeing another member of her species, and now there were maybe 1,000 right in front of her. Trying to ignore the persistent buzz, she focused on his question. Not really. I don't think so. No. Please answer definitively, the Shedling flatly stated. For once, the protective Madeline simmering below her smile was gone, replaced with sincere distress. Killerie found it unexpectedly terrifying. No, she firmly repeated. The Shedling visibly relaxed, its antennae falling to lay along its back. Good. You may board the Cronsis. Madeline pulled Killerie into a hug the moment he left, planting a kiss on her forehead. Grabbing onto one of her upper legs, she started leading her back down the hallway, leaving the Shedling room behind. She was walking a little faster than normal, enough that Killerie was forced into a half jog. Are you okay? Yeah, of course. Killerie replied and then hesitantly added, should I not be? A flash of vestigial concern crossed Madeline's face, replaced by warmth in a fraction of a second. No, I suppose not. Killerie tried to give her a smile, but it didn't really stick. Mom is everything. Oh, look at that. Madeline interrupted, maybe 100 feet away. The ceiling opened up into a giant cement dome with a small rectangular room in the middle. An incomprehensibly complicated series of wires and circuits rose from the top, poles extending from the box and ending in the wall. A line of people impatiently waited behind the open pair of steel doors in the room's side, and a human attendant counted them in with a clipboard. Do you know what that is? Killerie's worries were unwillingly drowned in the onslaught of inexhaustible curiosity that always accompanied new technology, and she skittered forward. No, what? Madeline followed her, relief etched in her face. That's what's getting us to the ship. Do you know what a Tessa chamber is? Oh, what chamber? Madeline smiled, and it looked like a sunrise to Killerie. It isn't exactly teleportation, but we're going to teleport to the ship. Killerie's voiceover put a layer of fuzz over the words as it tried to adjust to her attempt at volume, and Madeline's grin only widened. It's not teleportation. Well, what is it? If Killerie had been bobbing before, this was a full-on dance of excitement, scientific glee exploding from every chink in her carapace. Madeline started explaining it as she got in line, gesturing for Killerie to quiet down a little. Killerie unsuccessfully tried to keep her legs still as they waited for their turn, ignoring the annoyed expressions turned away. Well, I don't know exactly how it works. It just changes where you are. Killerie frowned. But that's teleportation. Madeline shook her head. I don't quite know how to explain it. It just puts you somewhere else without moving you. Killerie paused, trying to wrap her head around that. Wait, so I don't move, and it doesn't do atomic reassembly, but I'm just there. How does that... She trailed off as it sank in that Madeline really didn't know how it worked, which was a bit bizarre. Madeline knew exactly how almost every device back home worked. In fact, her mom easily could have handled anything the nuisance elves threw at her, which was a bit strange now that she thought about it. Putting that aside, Killerie watched as a few more people at the end of the line went into the Tessa chamber. The door swung shut behind them with a solid click. A weird tingle shot up her spine, but before she could even process it, the doors opened again. The Tessa chamber was empty now. I want to go in there. Killerie immediately decided. Madeline gave her a pat. We are. It took 9 minutes and 3 trips for Killerie and her mom to finally get in the Tessa chamber. The interior was completely bare. The only things in it were the luggage and their owners, most of whom were pointedly not looking at Killerie. Killerie started bobbing in excitement as the doors closed. What was it going to feel like? Was she going to see the whole universe at once? Was she going to be hurled through a wormhole at the speed of light, every atom in her body strung out as reality itself? Please disembark quickly and efficiently and ensure that all baggage is secured. Have a nice trip. The doors opened along with the announcement, sending Killerie's thoughts to a stuttering halt. She hadn't felt anything. We're here already. People started filing out as Madeline sympathetically squeezed one of Killerie's legs. Killerie stopped paying attention at that point. The area outside the matching Tessa chamber was luxurious, with a lush grey carpet and warm yellow light set into the ceiling. It wasn't what drew her gaze, though. Killerie walked over to the circular window and stared out at the green and blue planet before her. 1 or 2 starships crossed over it, casting monolithic shadows onto its even green surface, an oval horizon curving around everything. She could barely make out the patterns of massive housing arrays, along with farms and shops and who knew what else. The green moon Wursky peeked out from behind Odman, a vivid green-brown of farmland and cultivation. More than anything else, she couldn't believe how big it was, an endless curve enveloping the world. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't see where her house was. She'd expected scale, but not this. Madeline walked up next to her, pulling the luggage along. It's quite the sight, isn't it? Killerie wordlessly nodded. She never could have imagined that anything could have looked like. It made her all the more excited for Granitize. The room on the Krancis they'd been given was much larger than Killerie had anticipated. It was mostly that familiar shade of Shedling-approved white, with polished wooden panelling backing the various shelves and cabinets lining the walls. There was a rather fancy bathroom off to the side, which had a bathtub more than large enough for Killerie to fit in. The main bedroom had 1 bed and a lot of spare blankets, which meant she would be able to easily build a nest on the floor. And the final room in the suite had a flat screen, which was apparently a kind of entertainment device. Killerie had never heard of it, but Madeline thought it was quite nice. Killerie didn't have much luggage, so she eventually decided on tossing the suitcase into the unnecessarily large closet. Having unpacked, she asked the question she'd been wondering. "Hey, Mom." "Yes." Killerie looked out the window at the stars crawling by, incomprehensible speed barely making a dent on their lazy movement. Why didn't we Tessa straight to Granitize? It didn't take any time at all to leave the planet. Madeline shrugged. "I don't know." Killerie paused at that. The answer had come immediately and without hesitation or disdain, but it still felt like too short of an answer. "I mean, if we can Tessa to a ship, why can't we Tessa to a planet?" Madeline considered the thought. It probably has something to do with gravity. Well, okay, but why? I mean, are there any blueprints I can look at? Her mom chuckled and walked over to Killerie, pulling her up into a hug. "You'd take your vocoder apart if you thought you could put it back together." Killerie pouted under the hug. "I totally could." Madeline gave her another squeeze. Killerie stared past her shoulder at the vast expanse of space visible through the window. She had tried once, but she hadn't been able to find screws in the flat disk, and there wasn't any sign of glue or alternative adhesives. There weren't even any faint lines in the material to indicate they could be dismantled. The same was true for the telepathy caps at the end of her antennae. She had no idea where to even start taking them apart. Madeline stood back, watching Killerie's face. The young Shedling hastily arranged her expression, going for a perky smile. She wasn't sure whether her mother noticed, but now she wasn't certain herself whether what Madeline showed and what Madeline felt were always the same thing. Her projected excitement visibly staled and Madeline's forehead creased. Well, once you work up to more complicated things, you could try working on your spare vocoder. It's not that, Killerie muttered, trying to figure out how to put her feelings into words. She'd never tried to start a conversation like this with anybody, and she was worried she might be wrong. And if she was wrong, then she didn't know what would happen. What was the worst that could happen? Her mom wouldn't stop being her mom if Killerie asked questions. She didn't doubt that in the slightest. She knew that logically and rationally. She could reason through her entire life spent with Madeline, and every molten worry had been taken in stride. Her mom would understand. Her feelings told her otherwise. Well, she quietly asked. Madeline knelt in front of her. Killerie's glossy black eyes met Madeline's concerned blue ones, and the worries faded away. Mostly. Do you ever get scared? Madeline's eyebrows jumped her hairline, a quizzical smile crossing her face. Of course I get scared, everyone does, Bean. Killerie dropped her eyes, suddenly unable to keep eye contact, and she whispered, "Then why don't you want me to see it?" She had a very good view of Madeline's knees, but that meant she couldn't see her mom's face. Neither of them moved, and Killerie's stomach twisted uncomfortably. With a sigh, Madeline scooted next to Killerie and sat down, wrapping an arm around her as she crossed her legs. "Where'd this come from?" "Back at the terminal," Killerie mumbled. "With the Shedling." Madeline didn't say anything for almost a minute. The knot in Killerie's gut worsened. Finally, Madeline slowly replied, "When you're afraid of something, do you want anyone to know about it?" Killerie remained mute. Her mom kept talking. "Being scared, it makes you stop thinking with your head. When you know someone you love is scared, that makes you want to protect them, right?" She rested her chin on one hand. "I don't want to see you worry, Killerie. Well, you're getting bigger all the time. You're growing." Madeline trailed off, stretching her legs out in front of her, staring at the ceiling. Killerie pushed into her mom's side, folding her many limbs inward so she wouldn't poke her. "Love you, Mom." Her mom pulled her into a more secure hug. "I love you more." Twisting, Killerie rotated her head enough to look into her mom's eyes. "If you're scared again, can you tell me? Being scared together sounds better than being scared by yourself." Madeline sighed. "I'll try to cook her, Bean, but you have to promise me you'll do the same, okay?" Killerie gave her a small smile, a real one this time. "Okay." She hesitated for a moment. Back in the terminal, there had been a sort of fuzz in the background of her thoughts. She'd been too worried about the Shedling to pay any attention to it, but what if it was what the Shedling wanted to know about when it asked her if she felt different? What if that buzz was really important, and she just didn't know? She had no idea how upset Madeline would be if she found out Killerie had lied. But her mom had just told her they could be scared together. And Killerie didn't want to be scared of what her mom might say. Bracing herself, she said, "Mom!" Madeline gave her a hug. It's nice, but it made it a little harder to continue. She took a breath and barged ahead. "I lied to the Shedling." Madeline sat back, alarm lighting her features up, and Killerie hastily kept going before she could respond. "I didn't mean to. I got nervous when he asked me if I felt different because there was a buzz or something, but I didn't know whether it was something in the terminal, and I didn't want to get anyone in trouble." Her mom placed a hand on Killerie's head, trying to calm her down. Killerie, you'll be fine, all right?" Staring directly into her panicking eyes, Madeline continued, that wasn't a good thing to do." Killerie started to talk, but Madeline cut her off. "But this doesn't mean it's the end of the world." She pulled Killerie's head into her lap, kneading the smaller plates at the top of her neck. Killerie slumped, feeling the tension drain out of her. You shouldn't lie to Shedlings, but they're really good at noticing lies. If they didn't stop you from leaving, then it probably wasn't very important. Killerie twisted around, pleadingly looking at her mom. But Madeline patted her head. I promise it'll be all right. You trust me. Killerie stared back at her for a long moment, then sighed. Yeah, a lot. Her mom planted a kiss on her forehead, then stood up and started stretching. You know, I was reading up on that pamphlet, and I'm pretty sure they've got a pool on the Lido deck. She turned to look Killerie in the eyes, a grin on her face. Do you remember when we went to the ocean? Killerie scowled, successfully distracted. I remember the crabs. Madeline winced. Well, yes, the crabs were a downer. But what about the ocean itself? The swimming was nice, Killerie conceded. The crabs ruined it. Madeline's grin grew bigger. E-S-C-R-C-N-I-A. Killerie stared slight-jawed at the sight before her. Clean white patterned ceramic tiles stretched out before her, with only the occasional table to break up the flat surface. The walls were painted to mimic a clear sky, and a rack of towels covered one side. A weird, too clean smell filled the air. Not that she noticed any of that. A rectangular pond occupied the majority of the enormous room. Clear water lapped at the tiles edging it, occasionally spilling onto the ceramic as someone swam near to the edge. The opposite end was relatively shallow, with half a dozen kids and their parents were splashing around. The ground beneath the water gradually sloped down until it leveled out. One or two adults swam in the deep end, but most of the swimmers were in the shallow end along with their kids. That's a pool. Killerie swung around to her mum, still shocked. It's like a giant bathtub. Madeline smiled widely. She'd changed into her swimsuit, the same red one-piece she'd worn when they'd gone on the disastrous beach trip, and she had 4 thick navy towels slung over one arm. It is, except you can swim in this one all you want. Killerie almost dove in right then and there, but froze. Squinting into the deep end, she asked in a voice laden with suspicion, there aren't any crabs, right? 100% crab-free, Madeline confirmed. Go ahead, pulling her body underneath her. Killerie launched herself into the air, with her legs splayed out, and smashed into the rippling water face first. The impact stung her face for a moment, but once she floated a little further down, she opened her eyes. The water was remarkably clear, which meant she could see everyone in the pool. She couldn't help but wriggle in excitement. This was way better than the ocean. Alternating her legs in rapid movements, she dove to the bottom of the pool and clung to the floor, enjoying the feel of the water pressing on her planks and stomach. She'd always liked resting in her bath. It was what she imagined being in space would feel like. With a wriggly motion, she pushed off the ground and started clumsily swimming towards the shallower end of the pool, legs pumping. One of the kids in the other end was also submerged, a boy with brown hair, red swim trunks, and a pair of goggles. A burst of bubbles erupted from his mouth once he saw her, and he promptly shot up out of the water, wading for the side of the pool. More of the legs in her vision turned towards her, and in seconds the shallow end was churned into a froth from all the people vacating the pool. She had to swim a little further forward before she could get up. She didn't feel comfortable trying to stand on the sloped section of the floor after all. Planting her rearmost feet on the pool's bottom, Killerie lifted her head out of the water. Everyone who had been in the pool stood dripping at the edge, silently staring wide-eyed at the soaked Shedling standing in front of them. The expressions on display varied from fear and shock to hostility and confusion, but none of them left for some reason. Even the kids didn't budge. Suddenly nervous, Killerie sank into the water until everything from her eyes down was submerged, cautiously keeping an eye on all of them. What were they thinking? What had she been thinking? There was a splash as Madeline dove into the deep end. She was a much more competent swimmer than Killerie, and she made it to the shallow end in a few seconds. She staggered to her feet and pulled the hair out of her face, wiping her eyes with a ready smile. Ignoring the people at the edge of the pool, she asked Killerie, "Do you know what a cannonball is?" Killerie flicked her attention between the unabashedly staring bystanders and her mom, before curiosity beat embarrassment. No. Madeline climbed over the edge of the pool and headed back to the deep end. Taking a step back, she took a short run and then jumped, curling her legs and arms inward. Killerie flinched back as Madeline hit the water, a good-sized splash, dousing the already sopping Shedling further. A moment later, she swam up to the surface, wiping her eyes clean. Do you want to give that a shot? Killerie didn't have to put much thought into it. She scuttled up the side of the pool, avoiding the people standing along the pool side. They shifted out of the way, still watching her as she headed for the deep end. Backing away for a running start, she charged for the water and jumped. The instant her feet left the ground, she started curling up, but her jump had far less impetus than she'd thought it would, and she slammed into the water in a giant C shape. A flume of bubbles shot past her head, slithering back up to the surface. She poked her head out of the pool and reflexively blinked the water out of her eyes. Madeline was leaning on the side of the pool with a wide smile. A second splash of water abruptly hit Killerie in the side of her face. Spluttering, she shook her head and stared. There was a boy in the pool. The one she'd seen first, actually. The parents wringing the pool bore expressions of united panic, frozen in the motion of reaching out for him. Even Madeline seemed a little surprised. He awkwardly paddled in the middle of the pool where he'd landed. He had a massive, alarmingly stubborn grin on his face. "I'm Jason," he shouted at Killerie. "I won." Killerie froze. There was a person in the pool with her. He seemed to have jumped in intentionally, but that felt off. People weren't comfortable around her. They never had been. She flicked her gaze over to Madeline, totally unsure what to do. Her mum gestured to her encouragingly. Turning back to Jason, she hesitantly replied, "I'm Killerie. What did you win?" "My splash was bigger." He instantly responded, slowly dragging himself over to the side of the pool. Killerie glanced back at Madeline. Her mum was smiling wider than Killerie had ever seen her, and her face was damp. Probably from the pool, dashing the water under her eyes away with a quick hand. Madeline told Killerie, "Your turn." Startled, Killerie quickly scrambled out of the pool and shook herself off a bit. Jason took a running start and leapt into the air, tucking his arms and legs in. She had to admit he did make a pretty big splash. Taking a few steps back, she paused. She still wasn't sure what exactly was going on, or why Jason was talking to her, but Madeline seemed to think it was all right. There had to be a better way for her to make a splash than her previous strategy. She couldn't get very high with a normal jump, but there had to be a better way. Walking over to the edge, she reared up until she only had a few trembling pairs of legs on the slip tiles. Jason surfaced, spluttering with his eyes still closed. Taking a giant breath, he yelled, "That was huge." A background part of Killerie's mind wondered how he could possibly know how big his own splash was with his eyes closed, but she ignored it. With a convulsive motion, she clenched her stomach muscles and launched herself forwards, forcefully smashing the flat plate on the top of her head into the surface of the pool. The rest of her body tumbled in, and after a complicated bit of underwater maneuvering, she swam back up to the surface to see the results. The surface of the pool madly undulated with ripples. Jason had been pushed to the opposite side of the pool, and a swathe of tiles on the other end was thoroughly drenched, along with the people who'd been occupying it. Jason sputtered to the surface, flailing around for the edge of the pool. The moment he had a grip, he wiped his eyes, fixed his gaze on Killerie, and screamed at the top of his lungs. That was great. Before Killerie could reply, another kid jumped in, and then another. Some of the parents visibly relaxed, and a few sat next to the pool, resting their legs in the water. Most of them left with their kids, hastily drying them off with fluffy towels and ignoring their small complaints. Killerie kept an eye on everyone, nerves singing with alarm as she tried to find the lies, the people who were hiding underwater, so they could surprise her with a malicious punchline to a joke she'd never get to understand. 5 minutes passed. Several more kids added their cannonballs to the mix, and she hadn't been hurt yet. In spite of her malt-induced caution, she slowly started to relax. Killerie. Jason shouted from the side of the pool. He didn't seem to have any other volume aside from loud. Beat this. He jumped in, this time sticking one leg out and leaning backwards. The resultant splash was much larger, and a man on the sidelines, his dad maybe, whooped in excitement. Killerie's antennae lashed as she climbed out of the pool, trying to figure out how she could generate an even bigger response to Jason's attempt. 5 minutes after that, the pool was once again full, this time with a very large centipede and a very proud mom added to the mix. Chapter 7. A hopeful wish. Killerie awoke to the sound of someone talking. The lights were darkened, a product of the artificial daylight cycle that the Kranzis boasted, but a relaxing red light dully shone through the clouded panes of the window, leading into the hallway outside. Lifting her head from the slightly scratchy nest she'd made at the foot of Madeline's bed, she shook the sleep out and tried to listen. The voice was distinctly male and a bit electronic. Office, they've taken another 40 this week. Barak, when are the authorities going to step in? Killerie craned her neck around, trying to find the source of the voice. Madeline was seated in the other room, her face cast in blue light as she intently watched the flat screen. Her expression was focused, concentration hardening every line in her face. You tell me, but what are we supposed to do? Find a Shedling and ask. When has that ever worked? Okay, they might not be very approachable, but what? They rolled over everything we threw at them and then sat on their tails for over a century. What's their plan, eh? What exactly do they want with us? Carefully extricating herself from the blanket she'd been wrapped in, she quietly crawled across the carpeted floor, making her way over to her mum while trying to listen at the same time. She had no idea how voices were coming from the flat screen, but they were talking about Shedlings and she wanted to know why. Barak, calm down. I will not be calm. We've all been calm for far too long. More and more people are disappearing daily, and the Shedlings aren't doing jack about it. The European terrorists, call them what they are getting worse and worse. And we're getting no response from the bugs at all. Sneaking around the edge of the room, Killerie took a look at the flat screen. To her shock, there was a moving picture of 2 foreign creatures on it, but she didn't have time to fully look at them before the screen abruptly went black. She froze as she realized Madeline was looking at her, a semblance of something approaching alarm on her face. How much of that did you hear? Killerie had to think for a moment. Something about asking Shedlings. Madeline's face softened imperceptibly. Coming further into the room, Killerie approached the flat screen and put her face close to it. It had a picture on it, kind of like the ones Madeline's camera took back home, but this one had been moving and she wanted to know how. How does this work? Her mom's forehead creased. We should probably talk about it then. Killerie tried to ignore the statement, fully aware that her antennae were beginning to twitch. I mean, I know it uses lights, probably like tiny little light bulbs, but how do they get it to sync? And how does the picture appear on it? Is it transmitted? Madeline briefly closed her eyes, then got off her seat and knelt beside Killerie. Killerie, how do you feel about people? The eagerness Killerie had been projecting faded. The experience she'd had at the pool the night before had been amazing, but it was an exception. They act weird when I'm around, she tentatively put forth, and usually they're scared of me. Madeline put her free hand on Killerie's plate, shifting her position a bit. That's true. But do you know why? Killerie rested her head on the carpet, suddenly lacking the energy to keep it in the air. Because I'm scary. Her mom flinched, closing her eyes with a shuddering breath. When she opened them to look down at Killerie, there were tears in her eyes. No, Madeline corrected. It's because Shedlings are scary. Killerie gazed up at her mom, trying to figure out where she was going with this. But I'm a Shedling. She paused as a sudden thought struck her. I'm a Shedling, right? Madeline sighed. It's complicated. Shedlings all talk to each other. It makes them hard to understand, and it makes it hard for them to understand everyone else. If they ever talk to someone else, someone like you or me, it's always because they need something from us. But I don't do that. No, you don't, Madeline agreed. You are your own person being. But people don't know that until they talk to you. Killerie slumped. But I'm not doing anything. I know, Madeline assured her. But people aren't usually kind enough to give anyone the benefit of the doubt. Killerie was quiet. Then Jason did, though. And I can't tell you how glad I am for that, Madeline warmly replied. Without saying anything more, Madeline pulled Killerie's head up into a hug. Killerie leaned into it. The same way she'd always done, hoping the presence of her mom could banish the clouds in her thoughts. People were hard. She wanted to be able to know people and have friends, but the closest person she could call a friend was CR, and he was just a nice barista in coffee shop. He was huge, though she couldn't imagine he thought she was threatening. It all came down to being scary, as far as she could tell. Despite her mom's reassurances, there was a very loud and very persistent voice in her head that perpetually told her people were going to run away. She'd been right so many times, there wasn't any point in asking it to be a little quieter. Was there? Killerie glanced up at her mom, steeling herself for the question. What if people get scared anyway? Ignore them, Madeline firmly replied. If they can't see past your carapace, they're not worth talking to. Killerie stared at the carpet for a few seconds. And my fangs? Her mom smiled, rubbing the plates at the base of Killerie's head. And your legs and your antennae and every little bit of you. I wouldn't change a thing. Killerie's mandibles split into an involuntary, bashful smile. I did polish my chitty. Madeline beamed. I can tell, looks great. Frabbling over the carpet, Killerie pushed herself a little more securely into her mom's lap. Madeline immediately got a better grip and hugged Killerie between two pairs of legs, managing to wrap her arms all the way around her considerable size as she began to gently rock back and forth. Killerie's mind slowly churned through the information she'd acquired, turning to shallower topics. Mum, what's the flat screen for? What kind of aliens were the people who were talking? Wait, how does it work? Madeline sighed with a smile. That could take a while to go over, Cocoa Bean. Killerie folded her legs under her, yanking a blanket over and tugging it onto her plates. She inquisitively stared up at her mother, black eyes glittering with curiosity. Madeline chuckled, pulling Killerie's blanket further up and around her face. All right, here we go. The explanation had managed to hold Killerie's attention for longer than she'd expected, and now it was well and truly late. Madeline was back in bed and fast asleep if the rhythmic breathing was anything to go by. Killerie herself was back in her nest, and layers of blankets were snugly wrapped around her body all the way from her tails to her neck. Only her head protruded from the pile, with Boris the dog carefully tucked under her teeth. She was still thinking about the conversation the people had been having on the other end of the television. Another new word, but one with a lot of interesting implication. Killerie knew very little about Shedlings, despite being one. Some of them were smaller than she was, and some of them were a lot larger. They were all telekinetic and could talk to each other without using words. They all molted the same way she did, pulling herself inward. She hugged Boris tightly to her neck. If she was a Shedling, why wasn't she allowed to talk to them? Her antennae drooped down until she could see the hard white pieces locked around their tips. A pulsating blue glow emanated from just underneath the surface. A light so dim it would have been impossible to see in anything except the darkened room she was trying to sleep in. If the windows had been open, even the dull shine from the stars outside might have been too bright. Reaching her pointed leg out, she poked one of the telepathy caps. A scarcely noticeable throb accompanied the click that followed, and she slumped with a sigh. She had a weird urge to take them off from time to time, and she didn't know where it came from. It wasn't as though she could succeed. The caps were impossible to take off as far as she knew. Besides, the Shedlings probably had a good reason to put them on her. They just never said what it was or explained why she was the exception. Somehow her mind turned to the conversation she'd heard once again, picking out random pieces of information and putting them together. People were disappearing. 40 of them in a week. Nobody wanted to ask the Shedlings to help. Squeezing her eyes shut, Killerie focused as hard as she could on the end of her antennae and thought with all her might, hurling her silent wish into the universe. She thought about kidnapped people and panicking families and helping them somehow. She barely even noticed the buzz in the back of her mind, angrily fizzing in and out. The throb in her antennae briefly intensified, and her eyes snapped open. No Shedling threw the door open and announced everything would be fine. No whispered message came back to her and told her the people were all right. No one offered to take the caps off and let her talk to the species she'd been born to. However, wrapped in a nest of blankets and plushies, Killerie managed to finally fall asleep. Killerie couldn't help but do a little dance as she looked through the dense window of the Crancis, intently watching the glittering silver and blue planet gradually growing larger. Grenatis had never felt closer, but she knew she was still miles away from the ground itself. She was getting excited enough that a faint whine was gradually building in her throat. Behind her, Madeline finished packing up the suitcase she'd used for the trip, which really only meant her recently dried swimsuit and a change of clothes. Killerie could almost feel the smile her mom was aiming at her, which did little to douse her excitement for the oncoming activities she was about to do. "Are we tessering down?" Killerie asked, spinning around to face her mom, tails lashing in excitement. "Probably." Flipping back to the window, she tried to make out some of the details on the planet. "It's so big. Where are we staying?" Madeline chuckled. "The Shedlings have a hotel near the terminal. The plane ticket includes a room there for a week." Killerie's eyes grew round. "We're staying for a whole week." A genuine smile lit Madeline's face up, albeit a tired one. "Yep. Should be enough time to cross a few items off your bucket list, right?" "I hope." Killerie enthusiastically replied. "Now remember, stay close to me, okay? Siasa Grenatis is a busy place, and I don't want you getting lost." Killerie nodded distractedly, practically vibrating in anticipation. "What are we doing first?" Madeline laughed. "First we have to get down there, and then we have to check in. And then I thought you would want to get a few souvenirs. From there we can figure out what else to..." Killerie had only been half listening as she seized her suitcase, briefly thought back to the spider hopefully living its best life in her room, and charged for the door. "Mom, let's go. We're going to be late." "Late for what?" "I don't know," Killerie called back, bouncing from foot to foot. "I just want to go." Picking her suitcase up, Madeline walked over to her daughter and keyed the door open, gesturing into the hallway. Killerie hurried out, impatiently waiting for her mum to catch up. It took absolutely forever to get to the Tessa chamber, at least as far as Killerie was concerned. She internally groaned as she saw the line that had formed behind the clean white doors, the benches lining the walls laden with patient passengers, and gave her mum a pleading stare. Madeline looked amused. "I can't make the line go faster," being frustrated and fully aware there was nothing she could do about it. Killerie started looking around for anything interesting. She froze as she spotted a familiar face and started heading towards it. "Hi, Jason." Her new friend had been waiting with two people who were probably his parents, with luggage in tow. A giant smile bared across the young boy's face as he saw her. Killerie. She skittered to a stop in front of him, antennae flicking about in excitement. "What are you doing?" "Waiting." His dad snorted audibly at the chipper response. Killerie was undaunted. "Me too. Me and Mom are going to go shopping after we get there. Not before we check in." Madeline called from the line, and Killerie gave her a distracted nod. Jason's dad seemed a lot more relaxed than most of the adults Killerie had talked to already, and she didn't even know what his name was. "So you're adopted." It was a strange thing to open, but Killerie was happy to be talking to anyone. "I've been living with Mom ever since I was little." And Jason's dad drummed his fingers on his legs, considering his words. Do you love her? Killerie didn't even have to think about it. A whole lot. He squinted. All right, but do you love her like a... Killerie, it's our turn. Okay. She called back. Looking down at Jason, she happily told him it was cool meeting you. Thanks for swimming yesterday. That was fun. Yeah. She scuttled back over to Madeline, waving an antennae at Jason as she left. Jason's dad had a complicated expression on his face, and his wife had a raised eyebrow. They collected their luggage, and it didn't take long to go through the Tessa chamber after that. It was as uneventful as the last time she'd used it, but when the unassuming white doors next opened, Killerie was met with a new world. Well, a new building, at any rate. White walls with purple accents awaited the vacationers, gold-lined scarlet banners draping from the ceiling. The expansive room was well lit by electric lanterns set into the walls, and a pair of fountains quietly trickled to either side. A check-in desk waited a short distance away, with what appeared to be a rock attending it. People flooded out of the Tessa chamber, dispersing throughout the great room for a few moments to get some space. Killerie stuck close to Madeline, clearly remembering the rules she'd been given, without any indication or request to do so. A line formed in front of the rock. Killerie couldn't easily see over the heads of the people in front of her without stretching, but she could clearly hear a voice quietly speaking beneath the chatter of everyone present. Mom, I think it's another alien. Madeline chuckled. With the aliens here being? That kept Killerie occupied for a few minutes. The line gradually drained through the double doors at the end of the room behind the desk, and it eventually came turn for the Shedling and her mom. Contrary to what she'd seen, it wasn't a rock waiting at the counter. It was several rocks, a large central one with a dense layer of green moss connecting two stones underneath it and four more on each side. A familiar white disc perched on the top. It was almost as tall as Madeline. For some reason, Killerie could clearly smell it, a weird combination of lime and bleach. It stung at her senses and built her antennae, twitching uncomfortably from the cell. Despite its lack of eyes, Killerie clearly felt it was looking at her. Shedling, it flatly stated in a neutral voice, and then human. I'm her mother, Madeline explained, neatly cutting Killerie off. We're here on vacation. The rock was silent for several seconds. One of the rocks on its side slowly moved under the desk. It came back up, clutching a pair of bright red pieces of paper and tiny moss-made fingers. Welcome to Grantice in peace, Shedling and human. Thank you, Killerie brightly replied, tugging one of the pieces out of its moss with a brief twist of will. The rock made a grinding noise in reply before offering the other to her mom. With that, they went around the corner of the counter, pulling their luggage behind them, and headed for the double doors at the other end. People were already filing through, a low murmur of chatter causing a buzz in the background. Before they went through, Madeline pulled her over to the side, rifling through her purse with a creased forehead. Killerie's excitement was ramping up to fever pitch. A slight buzz filling her ears. She'd already met her second alien. How many more would she meet? 10? 50? 100? She couldn't help herself and almost started dancing, wobbling from side to side as she alternated leg pairs. Madeline gave her a warm smile. All right, Bea, you're an alien now. Killerie's mandibles twitched. I still don't think that's how that works. Madeline shrugged casually enough, but she was watching Killerie intently. Are you ready? She didn't have to think about it. Yep. Madeline still looked concerned. Okay, but remember, stay right next to you, don't talk to strangers, ask a Shedling if I get lost. Killerie impatiently recited. Let's go. I want to see more aliens. Her mom stared up at Killerie, worry scratched into the lines in her face. Taking a deep breath, Madeline allowed the tension to ease out of her shoulders. All right, let's go. With that, she stepped out of the way, and Killerie went out into a new world, already tuned to the maximum. Her already sensitive nerves were immediately besieged by stimuli, noises and smells and bright colours assaulting every part of her at the same time. With a startled yelp, she retreated back into the lobby. The doors must have had some kind of soundproofing. Was that possible? Backpedaling somewhat. She looked down at her mom. "Can you go first?" Madeline chuckled. "Of course, do you want to hold my hand?" It felt a bit strange for Killerie to allow one of her legs to be wrapped in her mom's hand, but far from bad. She did have to keep track of how much of her body was raised, though. Madeline's height was a good deal more consistent than her own. Bracing herself, Killerie took a deep breath. More prepared this time, Killerie followed her mom through the door, eyes squeezed shut. Sounds once again battered at her. A weird, striking sensation of smells stabbing at her senses. Ignoring them, she focused on the warm hand holding one of her legs. She kept walking, blindly staying right beside her mom, and hoping she wouldn't trip over someone or something, unable to pick out specific sensations. She was left snapping from one to the next, an unending leapfrog of things she'd never experienced, things she had no words to describe with, bringing a rising tide of feelings to the forefront of. Something hard and flat touched her stomach, and Killerie's eyes flew open in spite of herself, as her focus was drawn to something specific. The overwhelming stimuli surrounding her faded to the background. Madeline was presenting some sort of ornament. 3 oddly shaped metal straws interlinking with each other, twisting and winding around in ways that were hard for Killerie to track. "What is it?" Her mom smiled. "It's a metalwork puzzle. You're supposed to separate the pieces. Do you think you can do that?" Killerie frowned down at it, lifting it from her mom's hands. "Yeah, it's just..." "Okay, well, you slide. Why doesn't it?" The persistent itch, perpetually nagging at the back of her mind, was snagged on the puzzle, and Killerie found herself fully engaged with solving it. The metal pieces didn't actually work together nearly as well as she'd thought they had, and it was getting extraordinarily frustrating. Madeline chuckled, reaching a hand out. "May I?" Killerie took a half step away, practically glaring at the puzzle. "Hang on, I've almost got it." Her telekinesis fully enveloped the pieces. Her senses abruptly whited out, and Killerie suddenly could make out every nick and blemish on the surface of the metal. She could sense the oils from Madeline's fingers in certain places, could practically see how pressure had distorted the shape from the hands of those who had solved it before. That pressure could be replicated. The puzzle fell apart, and the world rushed back into Killerie's ears. She blinked, startled by the new experience, and then beamed at her mom. That was cool. To Killerie's surprise, Madeline unwrapped her arms between Killerie's segments and gave her a hug. Startled but not displeased, Killerie leaned into it. "Is everything okay?" "Yes," Madeline murmured, backing away. "I'm just very glad you're my daughter." That split Killerie's mandibles into a smile. "And I'm really glad you're my mom. You're great at momming." Madeline released an unladylike snort. "You're great at daughtering." Now, she stepped to the side, gesturing at the sights of granite. The distraction had allowed Killerie to gradually get used to the overstimulation, and now she could better appreciate everything. The architecture was unlike anything she'd seen at home. No building looked the same as the next, and most weren't even made from a similar material. One of them was floating. One of them was made from souping chunks of concrete, and one of them might have been alive. A great fountain sat in the center of the square, water ebbing and flowing from varied spouts concealed in shadowed areas to make it seem as though the very stone spat liquid. The road was built from perfectly segmented chunks of stone, cut with such precision that the mortar was all but invisible. Booths lined the outside of the road, vendors of every shape and size and origin spouting off requests to purchase their wares. Killerie had never seen so many aliens, so many creatures of a distant design. It was almost a little unnerving how unfamiliar everything was, but it was also exciting. Madeline smiled at the star-struck Shedling before her. "Do you still want to get a souvenir?" Killerie sniffed at one of the snacks on display, a weird spiral-shaped fuzzy thing nearly 6 inches long. She had no idea what it was, but it certainly smelled nice. The vendor selling, it was a tripodal beige-skinned creature with rubbery skin and too many eyes. Or at least she thought it was a heek. Was giving her and Madeline a slightly strained smile. Killerie. Or maybe he had to go to the bathroom and was being polite, but she was hardly one to make assumptions uninvited. "What is it?" she finally asked, backing off. The vendor's smile somehow stiffened further. "It's a Biervici, a local snack here. Would you like to try one?" Killerie glanced at her mum with a pleading expression, and Madeline gave her a nod. Turning back to the vendor, she happily replied, "Sure." He carefully removed one of the snacks and held it out. When Killerie grabbed it, he retracted his hand rapidly, almost as if his elbow moved faster than his fingers. An alien reflex mechanism, maybe? Putting it aside for the time being, Killerie stuck the Biervici in her mouth and bit down. It was cloying and bitter, but in a way that made her mouth want to cry. Swallowing, she gave the vendor an awkward grin, distancing the snack from herself. "That's a very good snack," she told him, happy for once that the emotion portrayed through her voter didn't quite match what she was feeling. He seemed enormously relieved by her stated pleasure with it, though, and she left feeling a little better about herself. She had experienced something new after all, and wasn't that what she was here to do? Killerie. The great centipede turned, shock and excitement balling up inside her as she realized who had spoken. Jason and his parents were walking over, luggage in tow, her new friend bearing a giant smile on his face. She skittered across the ground towards them, and Jason jumped forward. An intrusive memory of coffee shop. The malevolent boy sprinting forward as twin cups of hot liquid sloshed at her face, flashing through Killerie's mind. But before she could act on it, Jason slammed into her stomach and wrapped his arms partway around her in a hug. "Jason," Killerie squealed, the memory vanishing as she tried to hug him in return. "What are you doing here?" "We're on vacation," he enthused, pulling back. "Mum and Dad wanted to look around before we got to the hotel." "We're doing that too," Killerie gushed, happily dancing in place. Madeline approached Jason's parents with a ready smile, starting one of those adult conversations that made Killerie want to go to sleep. Jason suddenly noticed the snack floating beside Killerie's head, and his eyes turned round. Floating food. Killerie glanced at the levitating Biervici, guiding it through the air towards Jason. "I'm actually holding it. It's a Shedling thing, without touching it." "Yeah, just look." Briefly focusing on the unusual snack, she flipped it over and started rotating it. Jason's jaw dropped and he started spluttering. "You can..." and it just... that is so cool." He tentatively grabbed it out of the air, then turned to Killerie with an awestruck expression. "Can you do that with people?" She shook her head, antennae swishing through the air. "No, people are too heavy. I can't lift that much." Jason still looked awed. "Can you teach me how to do that?" Killerie squirmed. "I don't think Shedlings can teach telekinesis," she told him, apologetically hooking two of her legs together. "He wouldn't be too upset about it, right?" Her fears were entirely unfounded as Jason promptly ignored the statement, taking a bite out of the Biervici. His face wrinkled up, at first in disgust and then confusion. Looking from it to Killerie, he said, "That tastes like being lost." "I know," she agreed, legs alternating in excitement. "That's exactly what it tastes like." "Thank you." All three parents walked back over, still chatting. Madeline gravitated to Killerie, standing beside her with a relaxed smile. "Well, while you're here, why don't we take a look around?" "That sounds fun." There was a short moment of confusion as the adults tried to figure out where to go first. Killerie's personal suggestion was that they go find more new kinds of food. In spite of her unfortunate experience with the Beavici, she was eager to have more new experiences. While both of the mothers spoke, Jason's dad sidled over to Killerie. Hey, so I'd been chatting with Madeline a bit, and I just wanted to apologize for the questions I asked earlier. I've had better moments. Killerie blinked, her eyes shuttering with a click. What questions? He stared at her for several seconds, then ruefully shook his head. Yeah, okay, never mind that. Just trust me on this. They weren't good questions, I'm sorry. She shrugged, a shivery motion that made her whole body wiggle. Okay, what do you want to do now? Wait, Mom, I just had an idea. Circling around Madeline's legs, Killerie rambled as she walked. All right, so I was thinking about tech and stuff, and I realized that there's got to be someone here that sells something I can take apart. Can we go find it? Madeline couldn't help a laugh from bubbling out of her. You want to find someone without knowing if they're here or not, or if they even exist. Killerie confirmed happily, her legs almost shimmering as she raced around her mother's feet, having to walk on her own bag as she circled in a smaller radius. So can we go? I think we should do it. Jason's dad suddenly spoke up and all eyes turned to him. He withered slightly under the attention, but added, I mean, from what you told me, you're both here on your friend's request to make Killerie feel better. So this is technically Killerie's vacation. But you only just got here with us. Killerie half said, half asked, tilting her head in mild confusion. I don't think, aren't our vacations different vacations? Let's do it. Jason enthused, bouncing up and down as he held his mother's hand. I want to go with Killerie, Mom. Go where? She amusedly replied, receiving an exaggerated shrug in response. It's decided then, Jason's dad said, retrieving his luggage. Let's go find you a mechanic or an engineer or whatever it is you're looking for. Any idea where we should start? Madeline looked at Killerie, who promptly closed her eyes and slid away from her mother's legs, raising herself and pausing. She could detect a lot of unfamiliar technology nearby, that odd extra sense humming in curiosity as it scanned around her. There was plenty of it underneath every single one of the booths, which was interesting. Madeline had a bit of it, Jason had a little bit of it. Jason's mom had a lot of tech on her, and not any Killerie recognized the sense of. She resolved to ask about it later. Her mandibles clacked in irritation. There wasn't anything. Surely with all of this technology nearby, there was a mechanic to fix it. The more complicated something was, the more engineers you needed to fix it. That was why Madeline didn't want any newer technology in their house. If Madeline couldn't repair it, it wasn't worth having. Which seemed a bit odd, now that she thought about it. Shaking her head, she squeezed her eyes shut even tighter, feeling the fingers of her extra sense trickle outward, expanding as she focused. Is she all right? The voice of Jason's dad was like a jolt through Killerie's system, and she grimaced as the radius shrank. She heard Madeline's voice a few seconds later. She's fine. Just looking around, that's all. Comforted by her tone, Killerie took a breath and relaxed, feeling it spread out and seeping into the cracks of the ground, a slight tingle alerting her to the technology she was already aware of. But just outside of it, slightly past her normal range. Her eye snapped open, her mandibles spreading in a grin. Found it. Bouncing from leg to leg, she looked up at Madeline, her expression pleading. Mom, please, can we go? Madeline patted her plates with a wry smile. We sure can, Cocoa Bean. Where is it? Follow me. Killerie cheerily pronounced and headed off through the markets, an excited bounce in her steps. New technology. She didn't know why, any more than any of the other random little quirks that she had. But something about the thought of finding a new piece of tech had her wriggling with excitement all the way up her spine. Happily flouncing between booths and unfamiliar aliens, Killerie kept following her. Nose? Brain? She didn't quite know where exactly the extra sense originated from, and so she decided antennae would do the trick. Following her antennae, Killerie led her impromptu companions through the unfamiliar territory, pausing for nothing, except a cool fountain. and a floating house glowing blue, and a quadrupedal person, made out of metal and gears, countless cogs meshing together to allow it to function. She decided she was going to like it here very much. Killerie crawled over to the source of the technology she'd found, a sizable place built into the backside of a white cliff. It had a plant-like covering stretching out over the street from the roof. Several lamps glowing red and aimed inward. The real draw of the shop was the devices literally overflowing from the shelves, bins full of glittering metal and blinking lights. They even hung from the ceiling on hooks, innumerable machinations running on enough electricity to send a shiver through her antennae. Skittering forward, she raised herself onto her back half. Madeline and Jason's family were some distance behind. She'd been moving pretty fast. They were moving at their own pace, so they shouldn't have been out of breath. Jason's dad looked winded. Maybe he was really old? Returning her attention to the shop, she moved closer, trying to look over the counter. The red-tinted lamps above her were radiating heat, making her plates uncomfortably itch, but she ignored it in favor of the wondrous technology laid out before her. A snake lifted their head behind the counter, perhaps 40 feet long or so, blearily looking around before their eyes sharpened, fixed on her. Killerie had been hoping for a really interesting alien, maybe a cyborg or a plasma-based creature. The giant snake was fine, though. "Hello," she cheerfully said across the counter, her mandibles twitching. The snake's eyes narrowed. As their head rose higher, Killerie saw a mechanical chassis a short distance down their neck. It was large and had a lot of straps and parts she didn't know the names of. But the most important part was that it had two mechanical arms protruding from the sides. Their mismatched hands slid up to rest on the counter as they looked at her and said in a hoarse, rattly voice, "No." Killerie blinked. "No?" "No," they firmly repeated, their coils lashing about irritably. "I have a hard enough time selling technology of any kind without an engineer memorizing every design I've got and copying it 1 billion times over. It took me 2 years to refresh my shop. I'm not doing that again. Go find someone else to steal from." Shrinking back, Killerie glanced at them and then at the technology behind them. "But I just wanted to..." I said no. The snake snapped. Reaching up, their mechanical hands gripped the shutter gaping above the window of their shop. Ready to slam it down, Killerie darted forward, her eyes worried. "Wait. I'm kind of a Shedling." They paused with a sigh. Leaning down, they looked Killerie dead in the eye, their heads sarcastically tilted to one side. "Okay, look. I appreciate the speech synthesizer. It's very polite of all of you to start talking to us. But my wares are entirely technological in nature, and you are entirely plagiaristic in nature." Killerie shrank beneath their stare as they loomed forward. "Am I mad at you personally, though? Do I blame you for doing it?" "Certainly not. But does that mean I'll let you do it?" With all the scales in the sky, no. They pulled back with an annoyed huff. "Please don't come back." Reaching up, they slammed the shutter closed, leaving her outside. Madeline and Jason's family caught up a few moments later. Madeline was breathing lightly. Jason and his mum were panting. Jason's dad was straight up wheezing. Walking up behind her, Madeline patted her carapace. "Oh, what? I'm sorry, it's closed, Bean." "Anything else you want to do?" Killerie said nothing for several seconds. It twinged Madeline's motherly instincts, and she came around her with a concerned expression. "Killerie, is everything okay?" The Shedling blinked, her face settling for a smile. She found herself suddenly glad that she couldn't cry. It seemed like such an embarrassing thing to do in front of people. "Yep," she said cheerfully, the voice synthesizer perfectly imitating a tone that didn't match her current feelings in the slightest. "They were closed, just like you said." Madeline rubbed her head plates comfortingly, patting her soft underside just below her jaw. "We can come back tomorrow if you want. I'm sure they'd..." Killerie yelped, suddenly panicked. Madeline reared back, surprised, and Killerie hastily added, We don't have to. We're not going to be here for very long anyway, right?" Concern was written all over her mother's face. and she took Killerie's head in both her hands. "Cocoa Bean, are you sure you're all right? We said we'd tell each other when we were scared, didn't we?" Glossy black eyes stared into worried blue ones. If Killerie had learned one thing about people, it was that they were terrible at reading her facial expressions. So she let her mandibles split wide in a pleasant smile. "I'm fine, Mom." Madeline's expression eased slightly, but only slightly. "Okay," she murmured, rubbing the side of Killerie's jaw with her thumb. "I'm going to say goodbye to the lovelies now. Do you want to?" "No, I'm okay." Killerie deflected. Internally, she filed the family name away, partially wondering if she'd ever see them again. Madeline gave her an anxious smile, but stood and walked over to the lovelies, giving them their goodbyes. Out of the corner of her eye, Killerie could see Jason, his head tilted in confusion and hurt, wondering why she wasn't saying goodbye to him. She could only duck her head, feeling more miserable than ever.